So this is an exhibition called History as Personal Memory, and it's a show I curated, and there's 3 artists, and the artists are all, they were students of mine at some point. And through discussions with them, I started to realize that they all have a similar history in dealing with being part of the Second World War, and it's something that they never really had a chance to talk about as they were growing up. But as I worked with them as artists, I saw that, that was part of the work, even if it wasn't, prevalent. It was something there. So I thought, well, this would be interesting to get these 3 artists together and have an exhibition about something that doesn't get spoken about, either by the artists or the relatives. So Uli's father was in, and Cornelia's father, and Ira's grandfather, and they all came from different places. So Cornelia's from Australia, Ira grew up in Germany, and Uli grew up in Canada. So how do you get these diverse experiences to have a similarity? So, and the other thing that really interested me about the work is that they're dealing with a really dark personal subject matter, but in such a poetic and metaphorical and imaginative way that it reaches beyond the specifics of their individual experiences. So that was a part of the excitement of bringing them together. So I thought we'll start talking about Yuli's work, and then we'll move on to the others. So Uli Walker, these are a series of drawings done with an intense amount of charcoal. So it becomes metaphorical not only because of the darkness, but this idea of like erasing history. So she's using erasure to gain back history. And these are photographs taken by her father, who was an anti-aircraft fighter, and whenever a plane of the Allies crashed, he would take a photograph, so it was heavily documented. So she had all these photographs of planes that had crashed, and so she wanted to take these and use them to kind of represent this experience that she's just starting to remember. So it almost feels like they're made of velvet because the application of the charcoal is so dense. And then here we have Jacqueline Cornelia's work. And I originally was interested in work that she had done about Dresden, because she talked about that was her entry into starting to think about her past, because she only later on found out about Dresden and how it was one of the first the bombing of civilians. And so then she was thinking about, all the women and children that got killed. And so she had done these architectural drawings of burnt out buildings. So that was the work that I was thinking of for the show. But then in the meantime, she made new work. And so the new work has this idea of like the rose, and the rose, like in her artist talk, she talked about, we sometimes have a kind of sentimental idea about love, and roses and true love, but that love is actually so much deeper and much more complicated. And so she's trying to think about both the dark and the light at the same time with these rose paintings. So they're kind of a combination between drawing and painting. And I think when you look at them, you feel both. You can feel the dark and the light, because we recognize the rose as this symbol of beauty. But she also talked about when she made these, it was as if these roses almost stood in for portraits of people, faces. So yeah, and then we have the 3rd artist, Ira, who is with us. And Ira was one of my students way back in 2004, and she's been going through a really interesting transformation in her work, moving from the more abstract to the more personal. And so she's here, and she'll have a few words to say about her work.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. I grew up in Germany. I was born in '63. Both my grandfathers were in the party, but one of them was a Nazi. He was actually a Hauptmann in the Second World War, and he was in charge of aerial bombardments. That is something I didn't know when I grew up as a child, of course, because I grew up in a time that I call the time of like the leaden blanket, the time of no words, nobody spoke, and you just felt there was something wrong. People would just whisper, and then sometimes somebody would actually come back from Russia from being interned for many years after the war. German soldiers who had been fighting, they were like detained in Russia. And so we didn't know so much as children. We would just hear little bits and pieces. I some days ago, I told a couple of stories, like memories I have, and I have lots where, you know, you would hear something terrible, but the way people would treat it, they didn't want us to know. So I told the story, for example, when I was maybe 8 or 10 years old, and I heard my grandmother and my mother speak about a family, Rosenbaum, who used to be neighbors from where we grew up. And they talked about them, and I said, "Where are they now? Like, did they move away?" And my grandmother said, "Oh no, they were collected." Right? But only later, when I realized that one of my grandfathers was a Blockwart, so he was in charge of the quartier, the area. So he was in charge probably of denunciation. So he was probably in charge of them having been collected. So it's all these puzzle pieces that come together in a very painful and powerful way. My parents' generation have not been dealing with that. Like, my parents never took me to Auschwitz or anything. And when I go now, my mom says, "Why are you doing this? Like, why can't you just let the past be the past?" And I can't understand why she didn't take me. But I'm trying to understand that the second generation, they were little, they were born during the war, my parents, and they cannot deal with the guilt yet. So it's our obligation to deal with this guilt. So as you know, maybe in the last years, I always talked like officially about the German past. So what I did, I overlaid 2 maps from different times on top of each other and created abstract paintings to talk about the different identities, like places like Berlin had over time. And so, like, officially, I was always talking about the German past because I did not want to talk about my own past. And what happened last year, Wendy invited me to this exhibition. And at the same time, I'm doing my master's at the moment and in my second year. So I had done my first year work and I had done my proposals for the second year. And all my advisors and professors says, "This is great work. You talk about right-wing extremism in one film in Germany. You make a film about a Syrian refugee. You talk about burning refugee homes in Germany. I made a film which actually won a couple of prizes. It's called Meantime in La La Land, which talks about what happens in the world on the same day." I took images from the news and Facebook. All happened on the same day that 104 civilians were killed last year in April in Syria. And you see people post images of bears in a hammock and baby elephants in a pool. So like this innocence, but also like ignorance we have in the Western world towards what's happening around the world. So, but the professors and this invitation from Wendy came at the same time, and they said, "Where are you in the work? Can you make a film that only you can tell, the story that you can tell?" So I took that opportunity and I pushed myself, and I had to do a lot of research and a lot of reading. And I started with Foucault, reading about power structures. And then I was recommended Frigga Haug, reading about memory work. And then eventually I read about trauma because I myself went through traumatic events in my childhood through this Nazi grandfather. And so I finally talked about it. So I created a series of 16 paintings. I didn't know how to start, so I only place that felt safe was my garden, and I took a bucket of tar, and I was kneeling, and I created a series of paintings that talk about trauma. I don't know if they talk about it, but that's what I did. So, and all people say, like, what's with the color? And I must say I was not able to think about color at that time. So I created a series of paintings, and I created a film that talks about what happened to me.
Yeah, it
and
feels as if you're physically reenacting trauma, just through an intuitive response to it.
Yeah, so what I also included in the film, I also put my paintings into the film, and also it shows. I wanted to see how I can do memory work through working with my body, and I also wanted to use the work itself as a tool of investigation into memory work, and I could only do that with the readings, with the help of the readings, and that's why there's a lot of text in the paintings, and also I read Foucault and Nietzsche in the video, so because I was so informed through all the texts, and sometimes it's too hard to put things in own words, so Foucault was very helpful, I must say. So I used a lot of text with those, and but at the moment I'm also trying to write text with tar. So, and I must say, it's been very helpful and liberating. And I learned that too in my research, that when we start to write about it, when we start to articulate the pain in our work, we also take ourselves more seriously. And I'm 55 almost now, and finally it's happening, and I'm very thankful that I'm doing it.
Well, I think one of the things I really appreciate about this show is that all the work is quite personal, and as an art instructor, I always encourage people that to make good art, you have to really go to that personal place. Yeah. So that art is a really wonderful way to find out about yourself. Oh, and that is the work that's really the most authentic in the end, that comes from a really deep place. So Thank you very much for participating.
And also I'm happy that, I started here, I was in my 40s, I came here to Canada, and I thought I'd take a collage class, one course with Wendy, 14 years ago, and then it started to take off, and I'm happy that now that I start to talk about my personal work, personal experience for the first time in 14 years doing art, that it's coming back to Wendy and coming back, and I'm really happy about that it's happening here, because I feel it's the right place and safe place to do that.
So the exhibition continues until March 12th, so please come and see the show.